What's up guys, it's River and today we're looking at my top 5 mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless cameras have been growing steadily in popularity mainly because they can offer newer technology and lens choices that an SLR camera simply cannot. And I personally think that they're very exciting for both photo and video. So I made a list of cameras that covers both entry-level and advanced cameras, but be sure to watch the entire list because you never know when you'll find something new and exciting. So let's do a deep dive, figure out exactly what the mirrorless game is all about and which camera is right for you. Let's get into it. And before we jump into the video, guys, just quickly want to say thank you so much for all the super nice comments you guys leave. They genuinely make my day. And as always, whatever products we discuss will be down below in the description, so be sure to check that out. Let's get into it. So let's start this list off with the Sony mirrorless cameras. They more or less started the whole trend of mirrorless cameras, and naturally they've had the most time to do research and development and are pretty much leading the pack when it comes to mirrorless cameras. First up, we have the Sony A6000 and its slightly more handsome older brother, the Sony A6500. The Sony A6000 is a great affordable camera with solid photo and video capabilities. The Sony A6000 features a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. It does 11 frames per second in continuous autofocus in 12-bit RAW, which is pretty impressive at this price point. It does 24 up to 60 frames per second in Full HD, however it does not have 4K. If you want 4K, I definitely recommend upgrading to the A6500 or the A7 III, but more on that later. But the HD out of the A6000 is very similar to the HD out of A6500. Unless you needed a flat cinema profile for color grading or in-body stabilization, I don't think you need the A6500. The colors straight out of the camera are pretty mediocre, and that's pretty typical of Sony cameras. They don't have the best color signs. The A6000 does not have a cinema profile, but it's pretty easy to set up a flat color profile for grading later on. The autofocus in the A6000 is phenomenal, and that also goes for the A6500 and the A7 III. Sony is pretty much king of the hill when it comes to autofocus for both photos and video. It's fast, it's reliable, and it's insanely ahead of its time. The A6000 is actually pretty decent in low light. You can shoot up to 3200 or 6400 ISO without too many problems. Design-wise, this camera is very well built. Sony is known for making high quality product. It's Sony after all. The ergonomics of the button placement on this camera are great, and I love the fact that I can customize almost all of the buttons on it. However, the one thing that I feel really holds both the A6000 and the A6500 back is the really bad battery life. The battery life really isn't much more than 40 minutes to maybe an hour and 20 minutes, depending on how much you're shooting and if you're doing photo or video, but overall, the battery life isn't the greatest. You will need a cage for it for a proper video setup, but I recommend picking up a small rig cage for it. It's only about $100. The one thing design-wise that all three of these cameras lack is a swivel screen that comes out to the side. You can't really see yourself without getting an external monitor. As great as the A6000 is, and I absolutely recommend it to somebody that's just starting with cameras, who just wants to pick up a camera, do photos or video, it is a great camera to start off with, and it's not very expensive. But this camera is lacking in-body stabilization and cinema profiles. For an extra $350 to $400, you can upgrade to the Sony A6500, and that has a few major upgrades. One of them being built-in stabilization. Sony is known for having amazing IBIS in their cameras. If you're planning on doing a lot of handheld work or a lot of motion work without a gimbal, I absolutely recommend getting an A6500 simply for the IBIS. On top of that, the A6500 has several cinema profiles built right in for professional level color grading. This camera will not let you down when it comes to post-production. And of course, because it was released a few years after the A6000, the autofocus in this camera is even faster. Last but not least, the A6500 is much better in low light. You can easily do 10,000, 20,000 ISO clean. And while we're talking about upgrades, there's also the A7 III, but be warned, it is a very expensive camera. It's easily $2,000 plus, but it's like the big brother of both of these cameras. The A7 III features a full frame 24 megapixel sensor. And because of the larger sensor and the updated body design, you will simply get cleaner images and less noise. But I'll talk more about that later in the video. If you guys are interested, I definitely recommend sticking around. Next up is the Canon M50. Now you might remember the Sony A6000 doesn't have the best colors in camera, and it also doesn't have a cinematic profile, so it would make sense to get something that has great colors in camera. That's generally why most people get Canon. The color science is absolutely to die for. This camera has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor and an MP4 codec. MP4 is not the best codec for color grading and all that stuff. However, as I mentioned earlier, this camera has great color science built right in. As for photos, it does 14-bit RAW, which is an improvement over the 12-bit RAW of the A6000. It does 10 frames per second in single focus and 4.5 frames per second in continuous. To be honest, I think it's a much better video camera than a photo camera simply because the autofocus when it comes to photos is not the fastest. As for video, it does 24 all the way up to 60 frames per second in full HD and 120 frames per second in 720p. It also does 4K at 24 frames per second. However, when you go into 4K mode, it has a pretty massive crop of 1.8, which pretty much doubles all your focal lengths. It's not ideal for vlogging, and it can sometimes make it hard to frame and compose when all your lenses are zoomed in, but at the same time, a smart cinematographer, a smart filmmaker, a smart YouTuber can figure a way around it. But in my opinion, if you want 4K, I would probably skip this camera and look into the Sonys instead. As for the actual autofocus, it features Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is phenomenal. It's great at face tracking and it's great at motion tracking. It is fast, sharp, and reliable. However, because it's a budget camera, the autofocus is slightly hindered. When it comes to photo mode, it will only shoot at 4.5 frames per second in continuous. So if you want to shoot at the full 10 frames per second, you have to shoot in single focus mode. When it comes to autofocus, you only get dual pixel AF in HD. When you switch over to 4K mode, you get a pretty terrible form of contrast autofocus that doesn't really do a good job tracking anything. But here's the big reason to get this camera. If you want a budget camera with great colors, this camera is definitely for you. Canon has amazing color science. There's something about Canon's color science that makes all the colors just look absolutely perfect. The reds are nice and fiery, the blues are the perfect hue, the greens are deeply saturated, and skin looks amazing. If you're shooting a lot of fashion, people, or faces in general, I would definitely recommend using a Canon camera. As for the physical hardware, it's solid design and solid build quality. The body can feel plasticky, but it's actually anodized aluminum. The ergonomics on this camera are fantastic, and ergonomics is something Canon is known for. I really like the ergonomics of the button layout on this camera, but I really like the ergonomics of the software. Canon, without a doubt, has the easiest menus to navigate. It's a really easy camera to use, and pretty much anyone can figure it out in about an hour or two. I would absolutely recommend this camera more to a filmmaker. This camera has great video, great colors, but I don't think I'd recommend it to a photographer simply because of the slower autofocus. For photography, I would probably recommend a Sony camera. It has faster autofocus and a better RAW codec. Are you someone that wants to keep their camera safe while traveling? If so, this next camera bag could be perfect for you. Today's sponsor, the Everyday Camera Bag. The camera bag that's designed for everyday life while keeping your camera safe and secure. They sent me some of their bags and I personally love them. I loved being able to keep my camera safe and secure while also being able to carry my everyday things in. This way, I don't need two bags. The best part is it combines a safe and secure compartment with a water-resistant design so that I can make sure that my camera gear's always safe and secure. All this while being stylish enough for everyday use. I mean, it looks pretty awesome and I take it with me everywhere I go. It's affordable quality that will last and something any YouTuber, photographer, or filmmaker would love to have. The camera bag that's more than just a camera bag. If you use the code word RIVER, you'll get 10% off your purchase, but only for a limited time. So check out the link down below to learn more. And next up, we're moving into the more mid-range cameras. The next camera on the list is the Fuji X-T30, and I have to say the Fuji cameras probably have the most unique look on the list. This camera features a 26.1 megapixel APS-C size sensor. It does 14-bit RAW and has a 200 megabits per second video codec. In terms of video codec, that's actually double the data that both Canon and Sony offer. And it does 10-bit color in camera, which neither the Sony or the Canon do. It's a very impressive camera at a very good price. Photo-wise, it does 8 frames per second in continuous autofocus if you're using the mechanical shutter, but if you switch to the electronic shutter, it does 20 frames per second with a slight crop of 1.2. The 1.2 crop isn't that big of a deal. The electronic shutter does come with a few drawbacks, though for the most part the electronic shutter is totally fine. The electronic shutter will give you a bit of a jello effect, but that's common for all electronic shutters. However, in electronic shutter mode, you can't go past 12,800 ISO. Personally, I don't even think I would go higher than that. For video, it does full HD up to 120 frames per second, again at 200 megabits per second with 10-bit color. That is wildly impressive. For 4K, it does 23 and 30 frames per second, again at 200 megabits per second in camera with 10-bit color, and there's no crop. That is quite impressive. But if you're the type of person that's like, I like this camera, but I want just a little bit more power, This camera has two bigger brothers, the X-T3 and the X-T4. The X-T3 allows you to do 4K at 60 with a 1.8 times crop, but the X-T4 allows you to do 4K at 60 with only a 1.2 times crop, which is barely noticeable, and the X-T4 allows you to do 240 frames per second in full HD. It's pretty impressive. However, please note, both the X-T3 and the X-T4 are fairly expensive cameras. But if you're a camera nerd like me, definitely check out these cameras. And if you guys want me to make a video specifically about Fuji cameras, let me know in the comments down below. I may or may not be a massive Fuji fanboy. Shh. The best part about this camera is really the color science. This camera features built-in 10 different film emulations that give you really interesting film-like looks that come directly from Fuji's 35mm stock. So if you want that really interesting, unique cinematic look no further. It also has a flat profile specifically for video called Eterna, which personally I think makes skin look great, and it's very flattering. It also has F-Log, which is a log profile specifically for professional level color grading. The one thing that I definitely feel like holds this camera back is the autofocus. If Sony and Canon cameras are 10 out of 10, I would say this is about 7 out of 10. It's not bad, but it's not amazing either. It's very good in photo, and you really will not notice the difference when it comes to autofocus between a Canon and a Fuji, or a Sony and a Fuji. But when it comes to video, it tends to hunt quite a bit, and often it depends what lens you're using. If you're using the wrong lens, your autofocus might be a little bit too slow, and that's not because the camera can't pull focus, it's because of the motors inside of the lens. But if you're a filmmaker that never uses autofocus and does focus themselves, then this is not an issue. I highly recommend picking up one of these cameras. The Fuji X-T30 does not have any built-in stabilization, but it does have stabilization in the lens if you have a stabilized lens. But the Fuji X-T4, which is significantly more expensive, does have built-in stabilization, which is pretty dang good. Design-wise, it's a really unique camera. This camera is meant to be reminiscent of 35mm cameras from the 60s and 70s. It still has all the modern buttons and dials that you would expect, so the ergonomics feel modern, but it still has old school knobs for ISO and shutter speed, which are kind of a nice change. I personally love the ergonomics of this camera, but I can understand it might not be for everybody. Software-wise, this camera does take a little bit of getting used to. It's not very intuitive. And there were definitely a few things about this camera that took me a few weeks to learn. The one thing that I wish this camera had was a swivel screen that comes out to the side. Again, they have that on the X-T4, but the X-T4 is much more expensive. I think it would probably be cheaper to get an external monitor. Overall, I really recommend this camera to both photographers and filmmakers simply because it has such a unique look. Last but not least, we're heading into the advanced cameras. These are cameras you would only purchase if you're a professional or you're extremely serious about your Instagram flex. I know some of you guys are. I am. First, we have the Canon EOS R, which is actually Canon's first full-frame mirrorless camera. This camera has a fantastic 30 megapixel full-frame sensor that does 14-bit RAW and has an all-eye codec, which is Canon's professional level codec. When it comes to photos, this camera is not the fastest. It does 8 frames per second only if you're in single focus mode, and 5 frames per second if you're in continuous autofocus mode. However, if you're a portrait photographer that does manual autofocus, you'll still get the full 8 frames per second. As for video, it does 24 all the way up to 60 frames per second in full HD and 120 frames per second in 720p. And for 4K, it does 24 and 30 frames per second with a 1.8 times crop, which is a pretty significant crop. And I know what you might be thinking, this camera sounds really under-spec'd. It kind of is, but that's very typical for Canon because the reason you get a Canon camera is really the color science and the ergonomics. The color science in this camera is absolutely phenomenal. You have Canon's gorgeous, and I mean gorgeous colors right out of the box, which look amazing and almost require no additional work. For video, this camera features C-Log, which is Canon's cinema profile, and in my opinion is easily good enough for professional level work. Internally, this camera has 8-bit color, but with an external recorder, you can actually get 10-bit color. However, if you did get an external recorder, it would probably cost you as much as the camera. If you're an enthusiast, you probably don't need the 10-bit color, but if you're a professional doing commercials, you almost have to. This camera features Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is amazing at face tracking and object tracking. It's phenomenal in both photo and video. It's not quite as fast as the Sony autofocus, but I personally prefer it over the Sony autofocus simply because when it pulls focus from one object to another, that pull is more organic and it feels like a human, not like a robot. Build quality wise, this thing is fantastic. Again, it's a Canon camera. They make very solid products. The ergonomics on this camera are pretty good. I personally prefer the feel of a Canon DSLR. If a Canon DSLR is a 10 out of 10, I would say this camera is a 7 out of 10. Hardware wise, I really enjoyed using the camera, but when it comes to software, Canon totally takes it home. The software and menus are really easy to use, and it takes almost no effort to use the camera. You could probably give this camera to my grandmother and she could probably figure it out in a couple of hours. My grandmother's 90, by the way. Personally, the biggest selling point for this camera is access to Canon's new RF line of lenses. When Canon said those lenses were revolutionary, they were not kidding. These lenses are absolutely gorgeous, and I think they look better, if not as good, as the Sigma Art series. Also, another big plus when it comes to design is the fact that this camera stuck with Canon's LP6 battery. If you're a professional, you already know about this battery. Everybody loves this battery simply because it's so high capacity. You could easily shoot for 3 to 4 hours with this camera, no sweats. If the Canon R is a bit out of your price range, I would definitely look into its little brother, the Canon RP. It has a 26 megapixel sensor versus the 30 megapixel sensor, but I promise you, you will not notice those 4 megapixels. Photo-wise, that camera only does 5 frames per second in single and 2.5 in continuous autofocus, and it's definitely not very fast when it comes to photos, but it's still a full-frame camera with that gorgeous Canon look, and as for video, it still does full HD all the way from 24 up to 60 frames per second. However, it does not do 120p in 720, but it still has 4K, but only at 23 frames per second. And yes, it still crops to 4K, unfortunately. The Canon R system is really interesting because it's the first time they did mirrorless. Canon is known for doing DSLRs for over 30 years now. But if you're somebody that loves the Canon look and wants a mirrorless camera for professional work, this is definitely it. And also, when it comes to video, these cameras look way better for video than the DSLRs ever did. And like I said earlier, I'll talk about the A7 III later in the list. The next camera is the A7 III. Personally, I think this is one of the most interesting mirrorless cameras to ever come out. It has a fantastic 24 megapixel full frame sensor, it does 14-bit RAW, and naturally it has Sony's XAVSC codec, which is a professional level codec. Personally, I think this is one of the best hybrid cameras on the market, if not the best hybrid camera on the market. If you do photos and videos on a regular basis and you need a little bit of both, this is a great camera for you. This camera does 10 frames per second in full continuous autofocus, and mind you, this camera has one of the most advanced autofocusing systems in the industry. And it has a raw buffer of 33 images. That's pretty impressive for a full frame sensor that shoots 14-bit RAW. As for video, it does 24 all the way up to 120 frames per second in full HD and 4K at both 23 and 30 frames per second. Mind you, all of that is in an XAVSC codec that's 100 megabits per second. But a quick side note, if you take the 120 frames per second and you slow it down, that footage tends to fall apart quite quickly because when you slow that down to 24 frames per second, it's actually closer to 12 megabits per frame, which if you try to color grade, it falls apart pretty quickly. If you're gonna shoot 120 frames per second, definitely get your colors right in camera because you won't have a lot of room to push and pull those colors in post. And before you get turned off, don't forget, you're getting 120 frames per second on a full frame camera. There really isn't anything else on the market that does that. You can get it on an APS-C camera, but you cannot get it on a full frame camera. Even the Canon cameras only do 120 frames per second in 720p. And on top of that, because it's a full frame camera and it's a Sony camera, this camera has very good low light, 20 to 30,000 ISO, totally clean, no problem whatsoever. Last but not least, you actually get Sony's updated color science. The older Sony cameras had pretty mediocre in-camera colors, but this camera actually has very good colors right in camera. They're not as good as Canon or Fuji, but it's a big leap forward. But this camera comes with 10 different cinema grade profiles, so chances are you're not going to be using those in-camera colors anyways. If you plan on doing a professional color grade to your footage afterwards, this camera totally has you covered. It has a hybrid log gamma, S-Log2, and S-Log3. I won't spend too much time talking about the autofocus, but it actually has Sony's most advanced autofocusing system. It's very fast and very reliable, but pretty much every Sony camera has phenomenal autofocus. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this camera has in-body stabilization, which is a huge plus. A full-frame sensor with these specs and in-body stabilization, it's why this is one of my favorite cameras. I feel like at this point I'm supposed to say something bad about this camera, but even design-wise, this camera's a big jump forward for Sony. This camera has the Mark III style bodies, which has a better grip, better ergonomics, and better design overall. It's pretty much what every Sony user has wanted for the last 5 years. The only thing that they're missing is a swivel screen that comes out to the side, but to be honest, this camera has so many good things going for it, I'm willing to let that one thing go. But the thing that probably excited me the most is the battery. Sony cameras are known for having pretty terrible batteries. You get maybe 40 minutes to an hour with these batteries. But this camera actually has an updated Sony battery that is on par with Canon batteries. So you could easily get 3 to 4 hours of continuous shooting with this camera. The only thing I don't like about this camera is probably the price point. It's a pretty expensive camera, but considering all that it can do for you, it's a very good investment. Although there was a recent price reduction and this camera is just about the same price as the Canon EOS R. Specs wise, I would probably choose the A7 III, but Canon colors are hard to beat. So if I'm being completely honest, I'd probably still go with Canon. But if I'm being really honest, I'm probably too broke to buy another camera this year. I'm sad. Alright guys, well that pretty much wraps up our video on my top 5 mirrorless cameras. If you have any questions about these cameras whatsoever, hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to every single one of you. Last but not least, all of the products that we discussed today are down below in the description, so make sure to check that out. And if this video brought you any value whatsoever, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you guys are into art, photography, filmmaking whatsoever, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Professionally, I'm a cinematographer, and this summer, I'm gonna be bringing you guys a ton of content about how I broke into the industry, techniques that I use at work, and just like film photography work in general. So if you're into that stuff, if you want to learn new things, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys this summer. Take care.